neighborhood lined with tall oak trees and houses that carried stories of many lifetimes, there stood a modest brick home with white shutters. Behind its walls lived Margaret Turner, a woman in her late 60s whose days had grown quieter since her husband, Harold, passed away 3 years earlier. Margaret had always been known as the warm, motherly figure in the neighborhood. She and Harold raised 2 children who had since moved across the country, chasing careers and building families of their own. They visited when they could, but the house that once echoed with laughter, Sunday dinners, and the sounds of grandchildren playing had slowly turned into a place of silence. And on this particular evening, that silence weighed heavier than usual. It was her birthday. Margaret sat at the dining table, a small chocolate cupcake before her. She had bought it that morning from the corner bakery, telling herself it was just enough for one person. A single candle flickered on top, casting shadows on the walls of the room. She stared at it, her eyes glistening. She remembered how Harold used to surprise her every birthday with a bouquet of wildflowers, always wrapped in newspaper because he insisted that flowers were meant to be enjoyed, not presented with fancy paper. She remembered her children, Daniel and Claire, sneaking into the kitchen as little ones to decorate a messy cake with sprinkles that ended up everywhere but on the dessert. The memories made her smile briefly, but the smile quickly faded. The room felt too big, too empty. She whispered to herself, "Happy birthday, Margaret," her voice breaking. And with a shaky breath, she blew out the candle. Just as she was about to carry the plate to the sink, a sudden knock echoed at the door. She froze, startled. At this hour, she wasn't expecting anyone. The neighborhood had grown quiet and visits were rare. Cautiously, she walked to the door, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the knob. On her doorstep stood a man she didn't recognize. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, dressed simply in a denim jacket and jeans. In his hands he carried a white bakery box with a ribbon tied around it. "Good evening, ma'am," he said with a gentle smile. I hope I'm not intruding. I thought you might like this." He held out the box. Margaret blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The man shook his head. "No, ma'am, you don't. But I know today is your birthday." Her heart skipped a beat. "How could you possibly know that?" she asked, clutching the door frame. He hesitated before replying. "I work at the bakery down the street. You come in every now and then, and today when you bought that single cupcake, I overheard you telling the cashier it was your birthday. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't want you to spend it alone." Margaret's lips trembled. She hadn't realized anyone had been listening. For a moment she considered refusing. After all, he was a stranger. But something in his eyes, an earnest kindness, a sincerity that was rare, made her step aside. "Please," she said softly. "Come in." The man entered, carefully setting the box on the dining table. He opened it to reveal a small but beautifully decorated cake, covered in white frosting and adorned with delicate sugar roses. A single candle rested beside it. "I didn't know what flavor you liked, so I guessed," he said with a sheepish laugh. "Vanilla with raspberry filling." Margaret let out a quiet chuckle, her first of the evening. That was Harold's favorite. We used to share it on our anniversaries. The man's expression softened. "Then I'm glad I guessed right." They lit the candle together. Margaret, hesitant but touched, closed her eyes and made a wish before blowing it out. When she opened them again, tears brimmed, but this time they were warm tears, not of loneliness but of gratitude. They sat at the table, sharing slices of the cake. Conversation began awkwardly, but slowly unfolded into stories. The man introduced himself as Ethan Walker, a local who had recently moved back to town to help care for his aging parents. He explained that he worked part-time at the bakery while studying to become a teacher. Margaret found herself sharing memories she hadn't spoken aloud in years. She told him about Harold, the way he loved to dance in the kitchen even when there was no music. She spoke of her children, their accomplishments, and how proud she was of them, though she missed them deeply. Ethan listened intently, nodding, smiling, sometimes laughing at her stories. At times, his eyes glistened too, as if her words touched a place in his heart that carried its own wounds. At one point, Margaret grew quiet. She set down her fork and whispered, "You know, I didn't think anyone would remember me today. Birthdays used to mean so much, but now, it just feels like another reminder of what I've lost." Ethan's face grew serious. He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You haven't been forgotten, ma'am. People may not always show it, but your life has touched more hearts than you realize. Tonight, you reminded me that we should never let someone sit in loneliness if we can bring them light, even for a moment." Margaret's chest tightened. She placed her hand over his, her voice trembling. "You already have, young man. more than you'll ever know. They spent hours at the table sharing cake, tea, and stories until the clock ticked past midnight. The once empty home was now filled with the warmth of conversation and the sound of two souls connecting. When Ethan finally stood to leave, Margaret walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said sincerely, her eyes shining. "This has been the best birthday I've had in years." Ethan smiled. "It was my honor, ma'am. Happy birthday." As he stepped into the night, Margaret closed the door, leaning against it with a full heart. She looked back at the dining table, the empty plates, the melted candle, and for the first time in years she didn't feel alone. The next morning, Margaret woke with a renewed sense of hope. She decided she would no longer allow herself to shrink into the shadows of solitude. Inspired by the kindness of one stranger, she began volunteering at the community center, meeting new friends and sharing her warmth with others who felt forgotten. Ethan too carried that night in his heart. He often stopped by Margaret's house to check in, bringing fresh bread or simply sharing a conversation. Over time, their bond grew into a reminder that sometimes family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up when you need them most. Sometimes, kindness comes from the most unexpected places. Margaret thought her birthday would pass in silence, but one stranger's compassion turned it into a memory she would cherish forever. This story reminds us that even the smallest act, like bringing a cake to someone who feels forgotten, can change a life. And maybe, just maybe, it can inspire others to spread kindness too. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to Kindness Stories and join our family. We share emotional, inspiring, and true-to-life stories that prove compassion still exists in this world. Together, let's spread kindness one story at a time.